Hi, welcome back to History of World Revolutions. This is session 12 today, and today we're going to be looking at the last of the modern revolutions, in fact, the last of the revolutions we're going to look at in this course, and that's the revolution in Iran. Next week what we'll be doing is reviewing both in a summary sense of looking at some of the theoretical issues we started out with and how do they work themselves out in this process of revolutions that we've looked at, and what is the meaning of this whole process of revolutions for human history, but review also in the sense of going back and reviewing for purposes of the final exam. What are some of the things that you should be keeping in mind as you prepare for that exam? But today we're, again, going to look at Iran, and it really stands out among modern revolutions because if you look back through what we've covered in terms of modern revolutions, whether it's Mexico, but particularly the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, and the others, they all have a common set of inspirations to this extent that almost, well, every one of them, in one form or another, is influenced by ideas evolving from the 19th century, involving such things as Marxism, anarchism, socialism. We can find these common inspirations coming from the 19th century in these revolutionary movements in the modern world. Today what we're going to be looking at is a revolution that, at least in that regard, has very different ideological inspiration, one which is religious in orientation rather than a secular ideology derived from the West. This particular revolution derives its inspiration not exclusively, but to a substantial degree from religious issues and religious ideas. And in this case, certainly, as with all these cases, but particularly with Iran, we have to look at a historical background to understand why does that prove to be true? Why does religion play such an important role in propelling Iran into revolution in the third quarter of the 20th century at a time when every other modern revolution that we can think of in terms of significant revolution is driven by these more secular concerns, by these Western ideologies that have to do, again, with Marxism, socialism, and anarchism. Before we do that, let's briefly again look at a map to get a feel for where Iran is and what its significance is. This is a relatively close-up map, so you can't see a lot of the surrounding area, but you can see some of the important border considerations in Iran's history, one of which it borders Russia or the USSR at the time, the Soviet Union, to the south. It is south of the Soviet Union or Russia, and at the same time lies on the border with Afghanistan. Come back and discuss the significance of that. It shares a border with another important Middle Eastern country, which is Iraq, which you can just see over here on the far corner. And it also sits here on the Persian Gulf. And it is this area which provides an important waterway. Here is what is called the Strait of Hormuz, for example. This is an important waterway for shipping oil out of the Middle East. So in a variety of ways, in terms of the countries it borders, in terms of this sitting on the Persian Gulf where oil is exported, all of this has given Iran importance simply because of its location, its geographical location, if for no other reason. It also means that there have been a number of occasions in which Iran's domestic affairs have been interfered with by foreign powers, both its neighbors, such as Russia, but also from powers further away, such as Britain and the United States, and we'll see that today as well. The capital is here in Tehran, south of the Caspian Sea. Another important city is the industrial city of Tabriz here in the far northwest. Qom is another important urban center because it is a religious center. It is a center of training for the Islamic clergy in Iran. And all of these cities, as we will see, play an important role in Iran's history and what happens to it during the revolutionary era. In looking at Iran's history, we have to look at a broader history as well to help understand this idea that something other than Western ideological concepts are going to play a role in bringing about the revolution in this country. We have to look at the Middle East as a whole and some things that happened to it during the modern era. Because on the one hand, the Middle East has experienced similar concerns with nationalism as we see in other parts of the world, as we have seen in other revolutions. There is a secular concept of nationhood that develops in the Middle East and is significant in its modern history. But there is another side as well, people who see a very different view on how people should develop their identity in the Middle East, one that is religious in orientation. And we're about to look at that broad historical background first before we focus in on Iran. What I titled this first page is Secular Nationalism in the Middle East. And that's what I'm talking about in this first comment about ideas of nationhood that are drawn from Western concepts of how people identify themselves. This concept in the Middle East grows out of a number of factors. One is the breakdown of universals, meaning that there were certain universal institutions in the Middle East that helped give people an identity aside from any concept of nation, and indeed before the concept of nation had even emerged in modern history. Particularly the Ottoman Empire was one of the dominant forces in the Middle East. If we look at much of the modern Middle East, and we would not include Iran, in fact, in this definition, but most of the modern Middle East, places like Turkey, Egypt, Syria, etc., were under the control of a single imperial system for about 500 years. So there is this incredibly long period where there is a single state institution or empire that dominates in the Middle East. The breakdown of such imperial systems, of such universals, helps set off a search for identity for something other than that universal concept of the Ottoman Empire. How are we to identify ourselves as people living in the Middle East if we do not identify ourselves as subjects of such a large empire as the Ottoman Empire? Another universal, however, that did continue to pervade, even after the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, is Islam. The religious inspiration of Islam, the rise of the Islamic faith, traced all the way back to the 7th century AD, pervades the Middle East, even in the midst of the collapse of this great empire. And we're going to come back to the significance of that fact in a moment. But the reality is the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire did send people searching for other means by which they could achieve identity for themselves and for their community. Another factor that introduces itself at the same time that the Ottoman Empire is weakening and collapsing. Its full collapse didn't come until World War I. But even as a long-term process of weakening and final collapse is coming about, the Middle East faces another challenge, and that is the insertion of Westerners into this region in a significant, aggressive way, particularly if we look at the period of Napoleon Bonaparte at the beginning of the 19th century. Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Egypt, for example. This was indicative of a growing interest and concern by the West with the Middle East. And of course, as the Ottoman Empire weakens, it is less and less able to resist these incursions from Westerners. It's important to note here, because this is something that really distinguishes the Middle East from many of the other areas that we've looked at, is that these concerns were not just the possibility that Europeans, foreigners, would impose direct political control over the Middle East. That, in fact, happened only in selective ways before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. This concern is much greater than that. It is a concern with the very different kinds of values that Westerners and people in the Middle East have. For example, the simple idea of secularism that is so common in the West, that Westerners see the world as divided between the secular and the spiritual, that the world around us is the secular world. It's the real world. It's here and now. That's what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. There's a religious world, a spiritual world, but that lies in the realm of the individual. That's something that you practice as an individual. Religion is not supposed to control the here and now, the real world as we see it. It influences people's personal decisions, they go to church, etc., but the day-to-day world operates on secular principles. And whether I get into this university or that university is based on secular issues, test scores, etc., not what religion I belong to. It also depicts the world, the secular idea, as divided in a similar fashion, that there are certain laws and principles that govern the real physical world around us. And then there's a spiritual world, but the two are entirely separate from each other. And you cannot apply the rules that apply to the world around us, the physical world, to that spiritual world, or vice versa. This is a vision that's very different from the vision that is held in the Islamic faith, where the two are very much commingled, and where indeed spiritual rules and laws should apply to the everyday lives of individuals, that they should provide not just a personal guide for behavior, but that they should be a guide for the behavior and the rules and laws of all of society. That is one of the great conflicts between these two ideas, the Western idea of secularism and the Islamic idea of religious influence that pervades society. So the Western incursions raise more than just concerns with political control and economic control. They raise concerns about the cultural conflict that occurs between these two sides. The Western invasion, or arrival, at the same time helps people in the Middle East begin formulating ideas of how they're going to generate their own identity. Because what they know, at a minimum, even though they may belong to different tribes, even though the Ottoman Empire may be fragmenting, what they know is they are not Westerners, that there is that other out there, and that they can in part define themselves in opposition to these foreigners who have come and tried to impose their ideas from the outside. So this actually accelerates the process, the search for self-identity in the Middle East, as people begin to contrast themselves, their values and their beliefs, with what they see Europeans bringing to them. Another influence that the West has is the spread of the printed word. Printing presses arrive in the Middle East in a massive way, modern printing presses, not that there weren't printing presses in the Middle East before the arrival of Westerners, but the more that they spread, and they spread rapidly with the arrival of Europeans, the more that the printed word circulates, meaning that people can begin to share ideas about their identity in writing. I can learn what somebody else has said 1,000 miles from me, perhaps a few weeks or months ago, from a newspaper, information that I might never have received otherwise if it were not for the printed word. So in several ways, Westerners actually help accelerate the rise of concepts of nationalism in the Middle East, in part because they present this challenge to ideas and values of Islam, in part because they provide a mechanism for spreading ideas about identity in the Middle East through the printed word. Another factor that comes to play a role in the rise of nationalism in the Middle East is disparities in wealth. As Westerners gain influence in the Middle East and promote the commercialization of agriculture, they help promote disparities of wealth. Egypt is particularly notable in this regard. Egypt was one of the places where the Europeans were most present, where they worked most effectively with local elites to promote agricultural commercialization, turning, for example, to the production of cotton instead of basic foodstuffs. This often meant peasants losing their land, peasants becoming tenant farmers instead of peasant producers that were independent. And it means there's a growing number of impoverished people in the countryside as this loss of land and this loss of control occurs. This creates a group of people who are anxious to see this process reversed, and many of them will throw their support to the new nationalism that arises in the Middle East. As we'll see in a moment, they're also a potential audience for another form of identity that is generated in this region as well. Now, just to look at a few examples of people who pursue the course of secular nationalism, of trying to encourage people in the Middle East to identify with a specific nation. In Egypt, we see the National Party and the rise of this individual, Mustafa Kemal, in the 1880s, challenging the Western presence. By the 1880s, Great Britain has effectively taken control of Egypt, and the National Party challenges British rule and asserts, at least theoretically, the right to create an Egyptian nation. Now, up until this time, nations didn't exist in the Middle East. Largely been a series of tribes, people subjected in recent times to the control of the Ottoman Empire. Now, here was an assertion that a particular region in that empire, this province of the Ottoman Empire, now under British control, had the right to exist as an independent nation. In Turkey, the heart of the Ottoman Empire, we see similar ideas percolating even before they do in Egypt, with the young Ottomans in the 1860s, and the young Turks and Mustafa Kemal in the 1920s. Mustafa Kemal is really the founder of the modern Turkish nation. He was also known as Ataturk. These groups share similar ideas about the concept of nationhood, that people with common language, common culture, common experiences can form an independent national entity, a single independent nation. And their ideas, well, many of them are themselves faithful followers of Islam, focus on the secular issues, not on the religious issues. Turkey, even today, is a good example of this, the separation of religious and secular concerns far more than you see in other nations in the Middle East. These people are following ideas that are very much grounded in the Western experience of creating an independent nation, and one in which secular laws are the dominant influence on how society works. And while that religion is important, it functions largely in a separate sphere. Later examples of this same process in the Middle East, in countries like Syria and Iraq, the rise of the Ba'athist Party. The Ba'athist Party was another modern version of a nationalist party aiming to achieve independence and nationhood for countries like Syria. In fact, it remains an important influence in Syria even today. Finally, perhaps the best-known secular nationalist in the Middle East, Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, who attempts to create a Pan-African union by promoting Pan-Arab union, promoting Pan-Arabism, the idea that a series of Arab nations could converge, could merge their interests. But again, Nasser's main focus is as an Egyptian nationalist, believing that Egypt is indeed a separate nation, a separate people with a separate history and identity. These are the kinds of ideas that circulate in the Middle East in the first half of the 20th century, and they're ideas that, at least in their abstract form, would be very familiar to people in the West, all the way back to the time of the French Revolution. The first nations, such as France and the United States, were created. These people are talking along similar lines. But there's an alternative course for identity in the Middle East as well, and that is Islam itself. Because Islam also promotes the idea of a common identity, a community of the faithful. Very early on in the Islamic faith's development, there is talk of the development of a single super tribe, if you will, this super community of all of the believers in Islam. That concept becomes the basis for an alternative way of people in the Middle East achieving a sense of identity, a sense of community. We see this with the Wahhabi movement in the Saudi Peninsula in the 18th century. What was it? It was a movement rebelling against Ottoman control. It was eventually crushed by the Ottomans. But its purpose was to rebel against the Ottomans. The issue is, why were they rebelling? They were not rebelling on the grounds that we are asserting our right to nationhood, that we are an independent nation. Instead, their complaint was that the Ottoman Empire had become corrupted, that it was not fulfilling the ideals of Islam in the manner in which it administered the empire. So this is a very different basis for criticizing the empire. In Egypt, the criticism is, we're an independent nation. We have a right to assert our nationhood. This earlier movement, the Wahhabi movement, rooted in Islam, says our criticism is simply that you have not followed the precepts of Islam. Another advocate of this same movement was Muhammad Abduh in Egypt. And he followed a similar line, even though the dominant ideology in Egypt during the late 19th and into the first half of the 20th century was secular nationalism. Nevertheless, Abduh is asserting this identity with Islam. And this quote from him, I think, is particularly insightful as to how these people were looking at the idea of identity. He says, "He who professes the Muslim faith ceases to concern himself with his race or his nation." In other words, the basis of our identity is our faith, our religious faith. And this is why the Middle East is so distinctive in this regard, that this type of identity is projected towards people, and people can identify with religion versus nation as their principal source of identity. We see movements throughout the first half of the 20th century that are based on these concepts. For example, the Mohammedan Union in Turkey in the 1900s, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in the 1920s, and I should point out the Muslim Brotherhood even today is an important force in Egypt, in Egyptian politics. It remains a strong critic of successive Egyptian regimes because, again, its criticism is that they do not adhere properly and closely to the precepts of Islam. Now, Westerners have identified, and I'm using this term because it's just so commonly used in the West, what we call Islamic fundamentalism. That term is a misnomer because what we've done is take what we call Christian fundamentalism and taken that term and essentially substituted Islam for Christian. Islamic fundamentalism would suggest, well, as in the West there is this dispute over a literal interpretation of the Bible or the Quran in this case. But that's not the issue. This is not a dispute over the interpretation of the Quran, because people in Islam would agree that it is essentially a literal interpretation, and that one is not allowed to simply engage in these abstract and subjective interpretations. But people in the West have tended to identify a set of beliefs and movements within Islam that stress these kinds of ideas that I've listed here, and that is anti-Westernism, anti-secularism, and anti-materialism. Now, on the one hand, this is accurate to the extent that many of the movements that have most vehemently promoted Islam in recent years share these kinds of values. They're opposed to Western domination. They're opposed to the influence of Western ideas, and particularly Western ideas such as secularism and the focus on material goods and material wealth. But in fact, there's much more to these movements. What these movements are really looking for is a return to and effective lifestyle and social institutions which properly reflect what they believe are the precepts and the beliefs of Islam, that they feel that there's been too much laxness in the enforcement of the basic principles of Islam, because Islam does provide a guide for daily life and for social behavior, even for commercial activities, and that these values need to be closely adhered to. So it isn't just anti-this and anti-that. There is clearly within such movements an effort to promote the concepts of Islam and their proper enforcement within society as a whole. But at the same time, from the West, what we tend to see are the rejection by these movements of various Western ideas and principles. Most importantly for us, it is another means by which people can achieve identity other than simply the secular concept of nation, that they can rally around a religious faith and a set of religious institutions to achieve an identity that has been challenged both by modernity and by foreign domination. These kinds of ideas have appeal to a wide set of groups within the Middle East, although we're going to focus particularly on Iran, but especially among those groups that we talked about earlier, the disenfranchised masses, the people who were disadvantaged by commercialization of agriculture, by the influence of the West, by attempts to achieve modernity in the Middle East. And indeed, if we look particularly at the rural countryside, where the Islamic faith was certainly strongest, even in the 18th and 19th centuries and in the early 20th century, there, most people, if they were to choose between secular nationalism and a closer adherence to Islam, would follow a closer adherence to Islam. It is more in keeping with their own traditions, their own experiences. But it doesn't mean that they do not at the same time represent a revolutionary challenge to existing regimes, because they feel existing regimes, 20th century regimes, many of them cast in the mold of the secular nationalists, have failed to meet the needs of the people and have failed to adhere to the basic principles of Islam. So this idea of Islam as an identity for people, and even as a revolutionary ideology, has an important history in the Middle East. We're going to see in a moment how it comes to the fore in Iran. Now, Iran's history is not entirely consistent with that of the rest of the Middle East. First of all, most Middle Eastern countries are Arab countries. They're Arab-speaking. People in Iran speak Farsi, so they are linguistically, as well as various ways ethnically, different from many people in the Middle East. In addition, from the time of the creation of Iran's great empire, which is known as the Safavid Empire in the 1500s, Iran has been dominated by one branch of Islam, which is the Shiite branch, or Shiism, as opposed to the Sunni branch of Islam. Most people, the overwhelming majority of people in the Middle East, belong to the Sunni branch. But people in Iran, the vast majority, belong to this minority group of Shiites following Shiism. We're not going to get into precise distinctions between these two branches of Islam, except to say that one of the emphasis placed in Shiism is on the importance of rule by religious leaders. If not religious in the sense of formal training, then descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. There is an emphasis on the importance of religious influence directly within the governance of the state itself, not just in society in general. That's an important fact that will come to be of particular significance when we look at the modern Iranian revolution, that one of the traditions within Shiism is the idea that religious leaders need to have a direct and even controlling influence in the governance of the state. One of the other factors that distinguished Iran at this time was that its imperial army under the Safavids was made up of a series of peasant groups that were recruited by landowners. This is distinctive because other empires, such as the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, had built their armies on what were called slave armies. It's probably more accurate to describe them as professional armies, people who were selected as children to become soldiers and were trained from childhood as soldiers, that they had these professionalized armies. And the Safavid Empire was somewhat different in the sense that it drew upon the peasant population and specifically looked to local members of the landowning class, power brokers in the local regions of the empire, to provide those peasants, to provide those soldiers for its army. The significance of this comes particularly in 1722, when the Safavids attempt to invade their eastern neighbor, Afghanistan. They are driven back, and as a result of that defeat, the Safavid Empire collapses. So this empire created in the 1500s in Iran, the Safavid Empire, collapses as a result of the failed invasion of Afghanistan. This means that given the way that this empire was managed, particularly the reliance upon local leaders to secure an army, that with the defeat, the country, the empire, tends to decentralize, and power tends to wind up in the hands of local power brokers. And who are they? They are the religious clergy, the ulema, and local landowners. So we have a fragmentation of power. The empire essentially ceases to exist, and we got a lot of provincial power brokers who are governing local areas in what was once the Safavid Empire. The other important group among the leading elements of society are the bazaris. What they are, they're merchants. Okay? They work in the bazaars. That's why they call them bazaris. These are the three critical elements of the elite, if you will. The religious clergy are the ulema, the landowners, and the bazaris are the merchants. And it's into their hands that most power devolves as a result of the collapse of the Safavid Empire after 1722. Only gradually, over the next 3/4 of a century, is power finally rebuilt and consolidated to some degree by a new dynasty to replace the Safavids, and this is the Kahars. Looking at their dynastic rule from 1796 to 1925, this is a fairly decentralized imperial system. The Kahars will spend much of their time and power trying to consolidate state control and state power in Tehran, in the capital, in their hands. This is not, from the outset, a powerful dynastic system. They still must rely heavily upon local landowners, upon local elites, to provide the tribute payments, to supply the military forces that they need to govern this state, which at the time was known as Persia, but we're going to continue referring to it as Iran because it's just a lot easier. So we have a new dynasty by the end of the 18th century, but it's one that is struggling to maintain its control and to centralize power. Events outside of Iran would influence, as they often would, what would happen inside Iran under the Kahar dynasty. One of the most telling events occurs in the mid-19th century when the British face a rebellion in their important colony of India. It was known as the Sepoy Mutiny. The importance of this for Iran is very simple. Word of the mutiny took days and days to reach England and delayed the British reaction, their ability to respond and to get forces into the area to help suppress the rebellion. It became a real concern of British imperial rulers that Britain improve its communications network, connecting it to India. And one of the ways of doing that would be building a telegraph line system across the Middle East, and specifically across Iran. As a result, the British sent an expedition to Iran in 1857 to encourage the Kahar dynasty to grant them this concession, to allow them to build communications facilities across their land. Now, the Kahars were not anxious to do this. There was great suspicion of Europeans and of anything that smacked of Western involvement in Iran. There is already in existence this conflict that I talked about between Western cultural values and those in Islamic societies. But of course, the British have military force on their side. And the Kahars finally make the necessary concession. But more than that, the Kahars begin to recognize the opportunity that lays behind an alliance with the British. That the British can provide them with things that they don't already have. That the British can strengthen their dynasty, can strengthen the position of the Shah or the ruler. The Shah can be translated as Tsar if you want, if you're talking about Russia. Strengthen that ruler's command as a result of the resources that the British can bring to the table. And as a result of that realization and of the opportunities that the British see in Iran, accelerated by the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, because with the opening of the Suez Canal, now it's much easier for the British to get to Iran. Now there is this waterway that they can go down. And again, this map doesn't show it clearly, but we'll go back to it for a second just to orient you. Okay. Here's Saudi Arabia. Here's the Persian Gulf. Over in this direction is the Suez Canal. So all the British have to do is come through the canal, down around Saudi Arabia, and they're into Iran. Before they'd have to come over this very long land route through Syria, through Turkey perhaps, to get to Iran. Now they can use a water route that is relatively short, and this means some real trade possibilities with Iran because of the Suez Canal. These factors, both the interest of the dynasty and the interest of the British, lead to a series of concessions that are signed between the two sides. In 1872, one of the most famous was the de Ruyter concession. Baron Julius de Ruyter was a well-to-do British citizen who set up the Reuters news agency, for example. He gains a concession to set up the Imperial Bank of Persia, which will be a British bank. And along with that, certain concessions are given to explore for minerals. That early concession will lead in the decades ahead to the discovery and development of oil resources in Iran. But in the short term, this concession by itself, the banking concession, is important because it gives the Shahs, the Kahar dynasty, new opportunities for borrowing money. In the past, they'd have to borrow from the local merchants, and they might even have to make concessions to the local merchants in return for getting these loans. But now they can borrow from foreigners. They don't have to depend on the local merchants. Another such concession was the Imperial Tobacco concession, leading to the creation of the Imperial Tobacco Company. These concessions strengthen the hand of the dynasty by giving them access to resources that they would not otherwise have, and by freeing them from their dependence on local merchants, landowners, and even the clergy. A conflict is evolving here between the local power brokers, the bazaris, the ulema, the landowners, who want to keep as much power as they can in their own hands at the local level, and the dynasty, which wants to centralize power in its hands and is using foreign concessions to help do this, to help gain access to money, to resources that they would not otherwise have or that they would have to secure from these local power brokers. So we have this conflict emerging between local interests and the dynasty assisted by foreigners. A part of this mix, besides pure politics and power conflicts, is the fact that, again, the Westerners represent both a means by which the dynasty can strengthen itself and overcome the local power brokers, but it also means that this outside force represents Westernization, which is in conflict with some of the basic values of an Islamic society. One other group that's affected by all of this is the peasantry, because many of these concessions help promote commercialization of agriculture. British are particularly interested in promoting exports such as silk, getting land into the hands of commercial owners who will produce products that can be exported to Great Britain or to other parts of the British Empire. And as that process takes place, again, we see the loss of land by peasants, growing disparities of wealth in the countryside, and increasing unrest from this group. When we put it all together, we see that there are a variety of disenchanted groups in Iran as a result of this new opening that has created a link between Great Britain and the royal family in Iran. First of all, the ulema, or the Islamic clergy, are upset by the growing presence of Westerners and the whole idea of Westernization. Now, we need to emphasize varying degrees of this, because clearly what is going on here in the late 19th century is not nearly as acute, as intense as the Westernization we will see take place after World War II in the 1960s and 70s, for example. But nevertheless, there is this resentment towards the very presence of Westerners and people who have very little concept of what Islam is about, who have no respect for the values and ideas and beliefs of the Islamic faith and an Islamic society. And there was also a very real concern on the part of the ulema that if the dynasty becomes stronger and stronger, their position is weakened as local leaders. Merchants are concerned by the concessions, that they are losing control of many of these same monopolies that they once dominated as a result of these concessions to Western and specifically British interests. Perhaps the most compelling example is the De Ruyter concession and the establishment of the Imperial Bank, because what this means is that the royal family is no longer beholden to merchants for loans. This is no longer a lever which the merchants can use to try to influence and manipulate the royal family. Because now the Kahars can go to the British for their loans, borrow money from a British bank, and they do not have to be beholden to local mercantile interests. Peasants as well have resentments because of commercialization of agriculture, as we just talked about. Large landowners, some of them actually benefit from the commercialization of agriculture because in many cases they are the ones who gain new lands and are able to engage in this production of export products. But they too are concerned because, like the ulema, they have a great deal of control in this decentralized monarchy. The more the monarchy is able to assert power and control, the less power and control the ulema and landowners have. And this comes in the form of concessions, power that is given to the royal family. Also comes as a result of influences from the West, such as the building of telegraph lines. Telegraph lines within the country mean that the dynasty can learn more quickly about local rebellions, send troops out, try to suppress them. As they begin building more modern roads and a few railroads, again, you can get troops out into the countryside, out into the provinces, and suppress uprisings against the dynasty more efficiently. So from the viewpoint of all of these different internal groups, the more that the dynasty allies itself with the British, the worse off they become. More power to the dynasty, less power to local interests, and of course there is the continuing resentment. And it isn't just the clergy. You see this among merchants as well, for example, who are very religious, also among the peasantry, but they see less of this exposure to the West. But all of these groups have a concern about exposure to Western culture and the indifference of Westerners towards the values of Islam. These growing conflicts lead to an outright rebellion in 1905. This was preceded, by the way, by several other rebellions along the same lines. In 1905, the issue is the arrest of a number of merchants who are allegedly hoarding salt, which is a very important product. But that was just the triggering mechanism. The real issue was the growing power of the dynasty and the way it was consolidating power through the assistance of this Western government, namely the British. To resolve the conflict, the Shah agrees to a calling of a national assembly called the Majlis. This is like the Duma, this is like the Estates General, and in fact, what we've seen earlier in the course, this body serves as a very similar kind of function to the Estates General in earlier centuries in France. And that is, it was a calling together of local notables who would negotiate with the dynasty over certain issues. Usually this meant, when a majlis was called, that the dynasty needed a lot of money. They were going to have to collect additional tribute. They were going to have to get loans from the merchants. And they needed to work out some accommodation. What concessions would the dynasty give to these groups in return for securing additional resources? This is what the function of the majlis had traditionally been. And the hope of the dynasty in this case is not so much that it will secure monetary rewards, but the calling of this meeting of notables will help resolve the conflict which has led to armed uprisings. And indeed, the Majlis sets about, in a very serious way, resolving these problems by writing a constitution. If these local groups were opposed to many Western ideas, one they were not opposed to was the idea of constitutionalism, of having a constitutional monarchy. And that's what they hoped to create, because from their perspective, one of the influences that the West was having by its arrival, the British, was to create an ever more autocratic dynastic system in Iran. A way to counter that was by actually adopting a Western idea, which is constitutionalism. Write a constitutionalism that specifies what the powers are of the Shah and what the powers of the Majlis are. And in this constitution, it is particularly notable that one of the provisions required that any concession to a foreign power, a foreign company, a foreign individual, had to be approved by the Majlis, as did any foreign loan to the government. So the Majlis is cutting to the heart of the issue and trying to create a constitutional monarchy, and specifically trying to control the ability of the monarchy to reach out and gain resources from foreign governments, from foreign enterprises. So it's very clear what the issues are here in terms of the meeting of the Majlis, the rebellion of 1905, what kinds of issues are at stake here. And it involves particularly the growing power of the dynasty, especially because of the assistance it receives from a foreign government, from foreign interests. It appeared that with the writing of this constitution, that a major step had been taken in resolving the conflict that had spread through Iran in the decades since the arrival of the British in 1857. But in fact, the dynasty was unwilling to accept this new method of operation. And in 1907, the Majlis was closed down. The Shah simply decreed its closure. This, in turn, triggered new unrest in the country, because it was clear that the solution that had been arrived at by the writing of this constitution was being dismissed, and that the dynasty was trying to go back to what it had been doing in recent decades. So Iran, once again, is racked by turmoil as a result of the closure of the Majlis. Finally, in 1909, the Russian government decides to sort out the problems in Iran, or at least try for a solution, by sending in some 4,000 troops. I think the reason for this concern is fairly obvious, again, when we look at the map. Here is Russia, right on the border of Iran, and what concerns the Russian Tsars at this time, remember this is before the revolution, so we're still talking about the Tsarist government, is that all along its border and within the Russian Empire itself, are people who are of the Islamic faith. And there is always concern about instability in these areas. The clashes between Christianity, the Orthodox Church in Russia versus the Islamic faith in these bordering states, and more importantly, even within Russia itself. So the Russians have constantly had a policy, and this will be followed by their Soviet successors later on, of trying to stabilize the southern borders of Russia, or the Soviet Union, and to try to stabilize these Islamic groups to prevent the disintegration of the southern provinces or the southern republics of the Soviet Union over time. This is a long-term pattern. So what the Tsar does in 1909 is in keeping with the national interests of Russia, of the Soviet Union later on. Try to maintain stability in these southern regions, try to counter the militancy of some Islamic groups, and try to maintain overall stability across the region. And that is why troops are sent in here through Tabriz in 1909 by the Russian Tsar. Now, the Russian troops serve essentially as a means of stabilizing the regime, of assuring its continued control, especially of the northern part of Iran at this time, that they will not be toppled by the rebellions that occur elsewhere in the country. As a part of that effort, the Russians will train a special group of Iranian soldiers that become known as the Cossack Guard, named after the Cossack soldiers of the Russian army. And these are to be essentially a palace guard. They will provide the ultimate protection for the Shah and his family. However, conditions will change, of course, in Russia itself. We've seen the Russian Revolution in 1917. And this will radically alter, for a time, what the policies dictated in Moscow are to be regarding their southern neighbors. Because initially, the Bolsheviks are strong anti-imperialists. They are opposed to Western imperialism. They are opposed to Russian imperialism. And they do not believe that Russia should simply impose its will upon this vast conglomeration of different ethnic and religious groups that make up the Russian Empire. Now, their attitude towards that will change over the decades. But in the short term, one of their appeals to their own countrymen and to people around the globe is that they are anti-imperialists, anti-colonialists. And so one of the things they will do is withdraw those Russian troops in 1921. So the Soviets pulled their troops out in 1921 as a symbolic gesture, mostly to indicate, look, we are truly anti-imperialists. We are not going to try to impose our will on Iran or determine the course of events within Iran. Its domestic politics have to play themselves out without our interference. However, one of the remnants left behind by the Russian involvement was, of course, the Cossack Guard. And among its members is a colonel with political ambitions named Reza Khan. And it is he, in 1924, who stages a military coup and ousts the Kahar dynasty. Now, it's worth noting that Reza Khan himself, no matter what pretensions he later made claim to, was a peasant. He had been born in a small peasant village, and in a country like Iran, largely a rural peasant population, one of the few methods for advancement for people such as him was to join the military. So he had joined the Kahar military largely as a means of social and economic advancement. And then, of course, the opportunity came along to join the Cossack Guard, which meant a further elevation of his status within the military. And he uses that key position in 1924 to simply remove the dynasty. However, he has dynastic ambitions of his own, because in 1925, he not only abolishes the old dynasty, he creates a new one, and has himself crowned as the Shah of Iran, creating a new dynasty that he calls the Pahlavi dynasty. Now, Reza Khan's rule is not that radically different from his predecessors, the Kahars. For one thing, he's going to maintain close relations with the British. He recognizes, as did the Kahars before him, that they are a source of important resources, whether it's loans, technology, weaponry. And he, like the Kahars, has every intention of centralizing political power in Iran. And he wants to use this British connection to help him achieve that goal. The distinction between Reza Khan and his Pahlavi dynasty versus the Kahars who preceded him is that Reza Khan was better at this than the Kahars were. He was more determined, he was more effective in organizing the military, in suppressing rebellions, seeing to the building of additional rail lines to move troops more quickly. He was more effective at promoting industrialization in Iran. So this does not represent a radical shift in orientation for the central government in Iran in 1925. If anything, the basic ideals remain the same, the basic goals are the same. It's just that Reza Khan's better at pursuing these goals than his predecessors were. The same basic conflict continues between a centralizing monarchy and various power brokers, such as the Bazaris and the ulema, who are struggling to maintain their control over local society. Now, Reza Khan's successor would be his son, known as Muhammad Reza Pahlavi. It is important to note that the reason that Reza Khan would be succeeded within 20 years of taking the crown by his son was not his death, but rather the fact that he was forced from office, he was forced to abdicate the throne. And this, again, resulted from the influence of foreign powers. With the outbreak of World War II, the Allies became concerned with the supplies being shipped to the Soviet Union to help it in its war effort against Nazi Germany. This was critically important to the British and then to the Americans as well, because it was the Soviets who were fielding the most troops against the Nazis and who were fighting the largest segment of the Nazi army. So it was important to help the Soviets in their battle against the Soviet Union, against the Nazis, because they were doing so much of the fighting. And again, when we look back at this map, we can see why Iran was going to be important in this regard. It's hard to get supplies into the Soviet Union in the winter. It has a very limited number of seaports that are available and accessible during winter months. But here, when we look at Iran, we see, of course, the Persian Gulf. If goods could be shipped, supplies could be shipped across Iran, they could be funneled into the southern parts of the Soviet Union to help the war effort. And that's precisely what the Allies did, both the British and then the Americans when they joined the war effort. The greatest concern they had about this initiative, however, was that Reza Khan was actually an admirer of Adolf Hitler. He liked Hitler. He liked Hitler's style, can-do kind of guy. And the fact that Hitler had this idea about the Germans being an Aryan people. The fact is, the people in Iran were, in fact, descendants of Aryans. The Aryans were a light-skinned group who had invaded what is now India and other parts of the Middle East. We're not going to go into the complex past history, but there was some reality to this. I mean, Iran, as I said earlier, was called Persia through most of its history, was renamed Iran by Reza Khan because it meant the home of the Aryans. So he saw a certain identity between these rather strange ideas that Hitler had and his own beliefs about his own people, which actually had some basis in fact. So he's an admirer of Hitler. But here they have an admirer of Hitler who controls a critical link in the supply chain, helping to provide materials and weapons to the Soviets to help them fight Nazi Germany. Something's got to be done. And as a result, Reza Khan is forced to abdicate and forced to live in exile in South Africa, while his son takes the throne. His son, who is no more than a boy when this occurred, a teenager. He is, in fact, sitting on a throne that he occupies largely as a figurehead because it is the British and, to some degree, the Americans who are running things in Iran during most of World War II. Important, again, because, once more, foreign powers have intervened to shape events in Iran, and also because the Shah himself develops a deep enmity towards these foreigners, particularly the British, but also the Americans, who he feels have forced his father from office and have imposed this ignominy of really a farcical administration upon him, that he is nothing more than a figurehead during these years. However, as we will see, the Shah in the end finds it in his own best interests to maintain close ties to the British and the Americans after the war. Now, with the war's end, the Allies insist that the Shah restore a constitutional monarchy to Iran, not simply the kind of authoritarian rule that his father had exercised in the years before the war and after his succession to power in 1925. They want to see the Majlis restored, which it is. This is not something that is to the Shah's liking. He would much prefer his father's autocratic style of rule. However, he's forced to accept an elected Majlis on National Assembly, but he believes he can control the situation, in part because the military is loyal to him. Their appointments depend upon him ultimately. Their promotions depend upon him. And he has sufficient power within the government to usually manipulate conditions in the Majlis to secure a favorable majority. When he doesn't, he can simply abolish that particular Majlis and call for new elections, manipulate those elections, and continue manipulating until he gets what he wants. So it's not an ideal situation for him, but one where he feels he can control the Majlis when he has to and get done what he wants to get done. However, one issue comes to the forefront in the late 1940s, which is going to wreck these plans and this policy that he has of manipulation and controlling the Majlis. And that has to do with the British presence in Iran, and specifically its presence within the Iranian economy. Remember, when de Ruyter received that concession in 1872 for the Imperial Bank, it also had attached to it concessions that allowed for the search for minerals, mineral rights. That had led, by the early 20th century, to discoveries of oil. And before the First World War, Iran had begun commercially producing oil for export. By the 1940s, Iran was the most important oil producer in the Middle East. And that oil was being produced by the British concession holder, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. That Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was the original version of what we now know as British Petroleum. So this was a major stake that the British had in the oil industry in Iran. They dominated that, and it was the most important producer of oil at this time in all of the Middle East. However, the arrangement between the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and the Iranian government bore echoes of the past Iranian experiences with foreigners, and particularly with the British, in the sense that it seemed to be heavily one-sided. And indeed, Iran, compared to other countries such as Venezuela that had foreign companies producing oil on their territory, Iran, by comparison, got very little in terms of revenues from these agreements. So it was in a truly disadvantageous position compared to other oil-producing countries, both in the region and around the world, in terms of what it derived from the activities of the foreign oil company. As a result, in 1949, under pressure from Iran, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company agreed to write a new supplement, an amendment to the original agreement, what was called the Supplemental Agreement, to revise that arrangement and to provide more revenues to Iran. However, when that agreement was brought before the Majlis, and specifically before a committee, a subcommittee of the Majlis, set up to study the oil issue, the agreement was rejected by that subcommittee, a subcommittee that was headed by this man, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was himself a very interesting individual. His family was typical of those local power brokers who had exercised so much power over the history of Iran since the early 18th century, since the collapse of the Safavid Empire after 1722. And although Mossadegh himself had played various roles in the government over the decades, he had served as a provincial governor, he had been in the cabinet of the Shah, etc. Nevertheless, he was an ongoing and consistent critic of the regime and of the centralizing tendencies of the Pahlavi dynasty. So in some ways we see personified in these two men, in the Shah and in Mossadegh, the conflicting forces that had for so long existed and operated within Iran. The centralizing monarch and the local power broker who was trying to assert power for these local interests against an increasingly powerful central government. This conflict would continue to accelerate over the next several years. When the agreement is rejected, the Shah simply dismissed the Majlis and called for new elections, figuring that would solve the problem. However, instead of solving the problem, it only exacerbated it. In fact, it led to the assassination of the then Prime Minister of Iran. And now the Shah goes searching around for an alternative, someone else who can be Prime Minister. And he settles upon Mossadegh. This was a calculated decision on the part of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He knew that at this time, Mossadegh represented a political coalition in the Majlis, which effectively held a majority in the National Assembly. It consisted of groups like his own party, the National Front, plus the Tudeh, which was the Communist Party in Iran, and also the Toilers Party. The Toilers Party was typical of a number of political parties in Iran at this time in the sense that it was headed by religious figures and represented this strong desire to re-emphasize the role of Islam within society and within politics. Mossadegh's movement, the National Front, and other parties like it, were closer to the secular nationalism of movements such as the Young Turks, etc. Not that they were anti-religious, but just that their real focus was on nationalism, on identity as a nation, and less on the influence of Islam throughout society and politics. So we see in these different political configurations the distinct trends within Iranian politics at this time. Now, although they disagree on issues involving culture and social policy, etc., the National Front and other parties like it on the one side, and the Toilers Party and other religious parties like it on the other side, could work together on two grounds. One, they were opposed to the supplemental oil agreement because they're opposed to seeing the British continue to dominate Iranian oil. And, on the other hand, they were opposed to the growing power of the Shah. The National Front and parties like it because they wanted to see a true constitutional monarchy exist in Iran. The religious parties because they felt that the Shah was really a force for westernization and for modernization. He was too willing to work with and to bring in foreigners into Iran. So both groups, for different reasons, share some common policy objectives and allows them to work together effectively. And as a result, after Mossadegh is named Prime Minister in 1951, the Majlis not only rejects the agreement again, but orders the nationalization of the oil industry. So the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company is taken over by the Iranian government under the leadership of Mossadegh. What follows are several turbulent years of relationships between Iran and Great Britain. The British withdraw their technical people from Iran that are running the oil industry. They effectively impose an economic embargo on Iran. They are not going to trade with Iran, and of course Iran depends particularly on British supplied goods to run its railroads and its oil industry, etc. The British try to prevent Iran from exporting oil to other countries such as Japan, etc. So relationships between the two sides quickly disintegrate. And then in 1953, in August of 1953, Mossadegh is toppled in a military coup. And the Shah is once again left in a position to dictate events in the country. Now, why did the coup occur? In large measure, because of conflicts that had existed for 2 centuries in Iran between the centralizing dynasty and local interests, in this case personified, as I mentioned earlier, by the Shah and Mossadegh. The Shah was not only opposed to this attempt to nationalize the oil industry, not because he really liked Westerners, but because he wanted that continuous flow of oil revenues. But even more importantly, he was opposed to what Mossadegh was doing in trying to take full control of the state. Specifically, Mossadegh had taken over the position of Minister of Defense, not just Prime Minister, but he was also serving as Minister of Defense. And as a result, he was forcing many of the senior officers in the military to retire and appointing and promoting new officers. In effect, what he was doing was undermining the authority that the Shah still had within the military. And the Shah firmly believed that given enough time, Mossadegh would succeed in completely undermining his control of the military. Then the Shah and his dynasty would be left without a leg to stand on. They would control neither the Majlis nor the military. And in under those circumstances, the Shah was anxious to remove Mossadegh and see him thrust from power and see a restoration of the old order where the Shah both dominated the military and could effectively manipulate the Majlis as he chose. These were the main reasons for the military coup that displaced Mossadegh in 1953. There was more to this story, of course, than just the conflict between the Shah and Mossadegh. The coup in August of 1953 was in fact masterminded by the United States Central Intelligence Agency, working with senior officers in the military, with the Shah, who not only gave his permission, but also issued royal orders that were to remove Mossadegh and help legalize the coup. The problem was that when a Colonel Nasiri, who was authorized by the Shah to deliver these royal orders, went to see Mossadegh, Nasiri himself was arrested. So the coup plotters had to go on without the official sanction that they originally had. Nevertheless, officers of the Central Intelligence Agency were able to stir up sufficient unrest in the capital of Tehran using local crowds and to coordinate activities by the military to help successfully bring the coup to a conclusion in August of 1953. Again, the Shah did not cooperate with the United States and with the CIA because he was a pro-American, fond of the Americans. He resented the Americans. He resented the years that he had spent as a young boy taking orders from American officials. He resented the forced abdication of his father. But from the Shah's perspective, there was a practical decision to be made here, and that was his dynasty was at risk. If Mossadegh was allowed to proceed down the course that he had been taking since 1951, not only would the prosperous, lucrative connections for the Shah with the foreign-owned oil industry disappear, but his power over the military would disappear as well. And in the end, Mossadegh would achieve the goal that he had set out to accomplish, and that was to create a true constitutional monarchy, one in which the Shah would simply be a figurehead, while Mossadegh, the elected prime minister, and the Majlis, the National Assembly, would really run the country. It would be a situation akin to the British system, where the king or the queen is largely a ceremonial figurehead and real power is vested in the legislature. Given those choices, the Shah chose to support the Central Intelligence Agency and bring an end to Mossadegh's administration. In the aftermath of the coup, the Shah is quick to again rebuild an alliance with external forces. Only now it is not going to be the British, it's going to be the Americans. It is American oil companies like Mobil who form a consortium to take over the Iranian oil industry and to run it, much as the British had in the past. Now, again, the concessions to Iran are far more generous than were given before, but nevertheless, the same basic reality persists after the coup, and that is there is a major foreign power, now the United States instead of Britain, which is controlling the oil industry, dominating every aspect of it, from production to marketing to shipment, etc. In addition, the Shah is going to ally himself militarily with the United States by signing the Baghdad Pact. The Baghdad Pact was a regional defense pact signed by a number of Middle Eastern countries, including Iran, in Baghdad. And it functioned, or was intended to function much like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization on NATO. Here would be a U.S.-influenced regional military alliance that would help fend off communism in particular. The great fear that the Americans had at this time, of course, was that the communists would penetrate the Middle East and that Middle Eastern oil would be lost as Middle Eastern regimes were toppled and taken over by communist movements. The likelihood of that happening in the Middle East was virtually zero, but nevertheless, the Americans were concerned. And concerned as well that even if domestic communism did not flourish, that of course places like Iran were right on the border of the Soviet Union, and that the Soviets could, in a massive military sweep, conquer these countries and again remove this oil from the Western economies where it had been flowing for so long. So this is a new alliance forged between the Shah and now the Americans rather than the British. But conditions have not changed that radically. In many ways, what is unfolding here is simply a renewed version of the alliance that the Qajars had created with the British back in the late 19th century. Only now it's the Pahlavi dynasty, okay, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and the Americans. And as before, it's founded on important economic concessions, now focused on oil. And as before, it serves the same purpose of strengthening the hand of the dynasty, whether it's through oil production, through the Baghdad Pact, through military supplies that the U.S. was more than generous in providing to the dynasty. The Pahlavi dynasty, under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, is pursuing basically the same goals as the Qajar dynasty was in the late 19th century. This relationship has not altered itself dramatically as a result of these events in 1953. And the Shah will go a step further when he creates the secret police in 1957 with the assistance of the Central Intelligence Agency. The Savak secret police will help enforce his rule throughout Iran in the 1960s and 1970s through arrests, interrogations, tortures. What came to a head in 1953 was this long-standing conflict between the centralizing power of the dynasty with the assistance of foreign interests, as opposed to local groups, such as the Bazaris and the Ulema, fighting to maintain local control, as personified in this case by the Shah and by Mossadegh. The coup in 1953, however, simply delayed the final struggle to resolve these conflicts. It simply delayed the process, because what happens after 1953 is a renewal of the old alliance now between the Shah and the United States instead of between the Shah and the British, but the conflict remains the same, and the conflict will intensify for reasons we will see in a couple of minutes. Some resolution had to be found for this conflict between these two sides, and this is the basic source of the Iranian Revolution that finally erupts in 1979. A centralizing monarchy allied with Western powers versus local interests, trying to maintain their power and trying to fight off what they see as the evils of Westernization, secularism, emphasis on individualism and materialism. These conflicts were coming to the surface in the 1950s, interrupted by the coup. They will reemerge with more force than ever in the 1970s, as we'll see in just a couple of minutes.